It started like any ordinary day outside Buckingham Palace. The rhythmic footsteps, the polished boots, the silent discipline of the royal guards. But that calm shattered in an instant. A man, disheveled and desperate, broke through the crowd and pointed a gun directly at a guard's chest. People screamed, cameras flashed, and yet, the guard didn't flinch. He didn't move an inch. What happened next was so unexpected, so profoundly human, that it left both the crowd and the royal family in utter disbelief. This wasn't just duty, it was something far deeper. If this story already has your heart racing, hold on tight. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about royal guards and courage itself. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video. It really helps us bring you more true, powerful royal stories from behind the palace gates. Ready? Let's begin. Morning light poured over the black gates of Buckingham Palace, painting gold streaks on the cobblestones. Tourists lined the fences, their cameras raised, capturing the familiar spectacle, the changing of the guard. It was the kind of beauty that felt eternal, untouchable. The red uniforms, the silver rifles, the silent march, each movement rehearsed to perfection. And then, it happened. A shout. Sharp. Out of place. Heads turned. A man stumbled forward through the crowd, shoving past two startled tourists. His coat was torn, his breathing ragged, eyes darting like an animal trapped in headlights. In one trembling hand, he clutched something small and black. It took a heartbeat for the crowd to realize what it was. A gun. Screams tore through the air. A woman dropped her phone. A child began to cry. The sound sliced through the crisp London morning like glass breaking. But the guard, he didn't move. He stood there, eyes locked straight ahead, posture unbroken. Every muscle seemed carved from stone, every breath measured, silent. The chaos swirled around him, and yet he remained still. To anyone who's ever watched the royal guards, that discipline is legendary. They don't move. They don't react. Not to noise, not to mockery, not even to danger. But this wasn't a tourist prank or a camera flash. This was life or death. The man with the gun staggered forward. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Don't come any closer." But no one was moving toward him. The crowd had already scattered to the sides, forming a trembling circle of fear. The only one between him and the palace walls was the guard. A royal guard named Thomas Hale. He was 27. A veteran of the Queen's Company, Grenadier Guards, a soldier trained not only in ceremony, but in combat. Few realized that beneath the tall bearskin hat and ceremonial rifle was a man who had once served in Afghanistan. He had faced real fire, real terror, but nothing like this. From behind the black iron fence, a woman whispered, "Why isn't he running?" Another voice, shaky, "He's just standing there." The fugitive aimed the gun higher, eyes wild. "You think you're better than me?" he screamed. Still no answer, still that same unmoving silence. In that moment, time seemed to stretch. Even the pigeons froze mid-flight. In the palace walls, security alarms began to hum. Silent signals flashed in the guard's earpiece, a code to stand firm until armed backup arrived. But Thomas didn't need the order. He already knew. Panic could kill faster than bullets. So, he breathed. One slow inhale, one quiet exhale. He stared at the trembling man, not as an enemy, but as a soul on the edge. There was something in those eyes. Not hatred, not even malice, just desperation. And maybe Thomas recognized it, because just 3 nights earlier he'd been called to a scene not unlike this one. A drunk tourist waving a broken bottle, screaming about life falling apart. Thomas had calmed him down with words, not weapons. Sometimes, his captain had told him later, the strongest guard isn't the one who fires, it is the one who listens. Now, that wisdom echoed in his mind. The man's grip on the gun shook harder. His voice cracked again. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. They after me. They all kill me if I do not..." He stopped himself. Tears glistened in his eyes. He looked lost, cornered, like a man already condemned. Thomas could hear distant footsteps approaching, the sharp rhythm of backup rushing in. But the world had narrowed to just two people now, a guard who would not move and a fugitive who could no longer run. A reporter later described it as the longest silence London had ever heard. And then, Thomas did something no one expected.
He moved, just slightly, enough to lower his rifle, enough to let the man see his face beneath the brim of his hat. He didn't speak at first, just met the fugitive's eyes, calm and steady. The man's breathing faltered. His hand wavered. Then, in a voice low enough to be almost a whisper, Thomas said, "Son, look at me. You don't want to do this." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. Royal Guards never speak on duty. It's one of their oldest traditions. To break that silence is almost unthinkable. But in that moment, humanity outweighed protocol. "Put the gun down," Thomas said again, softer this time. "Nobody needs to get hurt. You're not alone, all right? Whatever this is, it can still end differently." The fugitive's lip quivered. His shoulders trembled. Behind him, the faint echo of sirens grew louder, and for the first time his weapon lowered. The guard didn't rush, didn't flinch, just waited, patient, unblinking, grounded. The kind of stillness that only comes from someone who's seen fear before and learned not to feed it. When the gun finally dropped to the pavement, it was like the entire world exhaled at once. Security swarmed in seconds. The man was tackled, disarmed, and led away, sobbing, shaking, whispering something about being sorry over and over. The crowd was silent, watching the guard, still standing at his post, motionless once more, as if nothing had ever happened. But for those who witnessed it, they knew something extraordinary had just occurred. Not a performance, not ceremony, but a glimpse into what true courage, quiet, compassionate courage, really looks like. That morning, Buckingham Palace didn't just stand for royalty. It stood for restraint, for honor, for the kind of strength that doesn't need a shout to be felt. When the news broke that a man had pulled a gun on a royal guard and that the guard didn't even flinch, social media exploded. Clips from tourist phones flooded the internet within minutes. Unbelievable. He didn't move an inch. How is that even possible? Thousands of comments echoed one word again and again: discipline. But discipline, as every royal guard knows, isn't just physical control. It's emotional mastery, a kind of inner stillness that takes years to build. And for Guardsman Thomas Hale, it wasn't something learned from drills. It was something learned from life. The footage played on every major network that evening. Reporters stood outside Buckingham Palace, the iron gates gleaming behind them, while anchors tried to explain the inexplicable. Why didn't he react? Was it bravery or blind obedience? The truth was more complex and far more human. Inside Wellington Barracks, where the guards train and live, the air was unusually quiet. No laughter, no casual chatter, just a deep collective silence. Every man in red uniform knew what Thomas had done and what it meant. To speak on duty is to break royal protocol, but to save a life by doing so, that's a line no one had ever dared cross. The commanding officer, Colonel Harcourt, gathered the men that night. "Some of you might think what Guardsman Hale did was wrong," he said, his voice steady. "But let me remind you, our first duty isn't just the crown. It's the values that define it: honor, integrity, and compassion." The room fell still. Outside, the media spun its stories. Some headlines called Thomas a hero. Others questioned his breach of conduct. But inside the regiment, something else was happening. A quiet pride, one not easily spoken of. To understand why that stillness mattered so much, you have to know what it means to stand post as a royal guard. Hours on end. No movement. No reaction. Not even a blink to the taunts of tourists who test your limits. It's not just physical endurance. It's psychological pressure. They train for it in ways that would surprise most people. In rooms where loud noises, distractions, and verbal jabs are thrown their way, they must maintain absolute composure. The goal isn't to ignore, it's to control. To acknowledge every impulse and yet not act on it. As one former guard described, you become the wall. You hear everything, see everything, but you let nothing move you. That was exactly what Thomas did that morning, until he saw the man's eyes. And for the first time in his service, he allowed something to move him, empathy. In the days after the incident, Palace security reviewed every second of the footage. What they found astonished them. The gunman, later identified as Daniel Mercer, a 32-year-old fugitive wanted for a series of petty robberies, had no real intent to harm anyone. His gun was unloaded. He'd panicked after being cornered by police and stumbled into the palace crowd without a plan. But the danger still felt real, painfully real, to those who were there. And Thomas's reaction, or lack of it, had prevented a full-scale tragedy. Had he reacted too quickly, drawn his weapon, or even shouted, the armed response team would have fired. Dozens of lives might have been caught in the chaos. By doing nothing, he saved everyone. When asked later why he spoke, Thomas's reply was simple: because I saw fear, not evil. That single sentence would echo through the media for weeks. People debated it, analyzed it, even quoted it on social platforms. Some called it naive, others called it profound, but most agreed it revealed something rare, a soldier who understood that strength wasn't only about power but restraint. Days later, a private meeting was arranged. Thomas was summoned to a quiet room in the palace. Just him, his superior officer, and 2 members of the Royal Security Council. He expected reprimand. Instead, he found something else entirely. One of the officials, a woman from the Royal Communications Office, leaned forward and said, "Do you realize the image that's gone around the world today? The guard who stood still, the man who spoke peace instead of violence. That's not a scandal, guardsman. That's Britain at its best." Thomas didn't know how to respond. He wasn't seeking praise. In fact, he wanted none of it. He only said, "Ma'am, I just did what anyone should have done." But not everyone would have done what he did. That was the truth. For days afterward, the palace guards noticed something different among the crowds. There was more silence, more respect. People didn't mock or tease, as they sometimes did. They stood a little taller, watching the guards with a kind of newfound awe. It wasn't fear, it was understanding. Understanding that behind every stoic face was a person, someone capable of extraordinary control and, when needed, extraordinary compassion. Tourists began leaving small notes near the gates. "Thank you for your bravery. Respect to the silent heroes." One note, scrawled in a child's handwriting, read, "You were like a statue, but you had a heart." Thomas never read those notes, at least not officially, but one of his fellow guards quietly passed a few to him. He kept them folded in his locker, tucked behind his service medals. That week, British media ran a segment called The Unmoving Wall. It described how one guard's calm in the face of danger became a symbol of quiet courage, the kind that doesn't make headlines often, but defines a nation's character when it does. And somewhere, deep down, even the royal family felt it, because what the public didn't know, not yet, was that one particular member of the family had watched the footage personally, someone who would soon insist on meeting the man behind the bearskin hat. That meeting would change everything. The official report called it a control containment incident, but to those who witnessed it, it was something closer to a miracle. Days after the standoff, as the crowds returned to their normal rhythm outside Buckingham Palace, Guardsman Thomas Hale resumed his post as though nothing had changed. Same stance, same uniform, same unblinking eyes. Yet inside, something had changed. He could feel the weight of what had happened, not pride, but reflection. Every moment of that morning replayed in his mind, the trembling hands, the desperate eyes, the quiet surrender. And somewhere deep inside, he wondered if he had truly done the right thing. That answer would come from the most unexpected place. A royal aide approached him one afternoon. "Guardsman Hale," she said quietly, "His Royal Highness would like to speak with you privately." Thomas froze. The last time he'd been summoned to a private audience, it was for a disciplinary review. Now, after all this media attention, he assumed the same. He followed the aide through a series of hallways, polished marble floors, portraits of kings and queens, their painted eyes following him down the corridor. At the end of that hall stood Prince William. He turned as Thomas entered, offering a rare, easy smile. "You must be the man everyone's been talking about." Thomas stiffened, saluting instinctively. "Your Royal Highness." "At ease," William said. His tone was warm, yet measured. He gestured toward a chair. "Please sit. This won't take long." Thomas hesitated, then sat, his posture still straight, his face unreadable. For a moment, silence lingered between them, the kind of silence that felt heavy, but not uncomfortable. William leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "I watched the footage," he said softly. "Twice, actually. It's remarkable, not for what you did, but for what you didn't do." Thomas didn't know what to say. He stared ahead, trying to keep his expression professional. But inside, he was anxious, unsure if this was praise or reprimand. William continued. "Most soldiers, most men would have reacted. You didn't. You showed restraint that even seasoned officers struggle with. And when you finally did act, you chose empathy." He paused, studying Thomas's face. "Why?" The question hung in the air. Thomas swallowed, then answered honestly. "Because I saw a man who wasn't a threat, just scared. I thought if I could reach him, maybe I could stop something worse from happening. I wasn't thinking about rules, sir, just people." Prince William nodded slowly, a flicker of admiration crossing his face. "That's what caught my attention. You weren't just a guard that day. You were a guardian." Thomas blinked, unsure how to respond. "You reminded people what these uniforms stand for," William added. "It's not just ceremony. It's service. Duty, yes, but also humanity. And in a time when the world sees soldiers as stone, you showed heart." The words landed deeper than Thomas expected. Coming from a future king and a veteran himself, they meant more than any medal could. Then William said something Thomas would never forget. "Protocol can be rewritten. Character cannot." Later, when the story reached the press, the palace simply described it as a private commendation. No photographs, no publicity stunt, just a quiet act of recognition behind closed doors. But within the ranks of the Royal Guard, the message spread fast. Thomas Hale had not been punished. He had been honored. It was said that William himself sent a handwritten note afterward, short, simple, but profound. "You protected more than the crown that day. You protected our values. Thank you." That note would later be framed and hung in the guardsmen's quarters, not as a symbol of rebellion, but of something greater. The reminder that even the strictest traditions can bend when guided by conscience. Meanwhile, the man who had pulled the gun, Daniel Mercer, faced his own reckoning. In a small London courtroom, his story unfolded in full. A former factory worker, lost his job, lost his home, then lost himself. He had been running from debt collectors, his mind frayed by fear and regret. The gun was never loaded. He only wanted attention, a cry for help in the wrong place, at the worst possible time. When Thomas's testimony was read aloud, that he had seen fear, not evil, even the judge paused. It wasn't a statement of defense. It was mercy. Daniel was sentenced not to prison, but to psychiatric care. The court cited Thomas's calm intervention as a key factor in preventing tragedy. That day, as Daniel was led away, he looked up at Thomas and whispered, "Thank you for not seeing me as a monster." Thomas only nodded, because to him, compassion wasn't weakness. It was strength under control. The media moved on eventually, as it always does. New stories took the spotlight. But among those who knew what really happened that morning, something lingered. A respect, a quiet pride, and a renewed understanding of what courage truly meant. Not the kind that's loud or heroic. Not the kind that ends with applause. But the kind that stands still when everything else is falling apart. Weeks later, while standing on duty once again beneath the gates, Thomas noticed a small group watching him. Not tourists this time, but veterans. They stood silently, hats off, their faces solemn. One of them gave a slow salute. For the first time in his service, Thomas allowed himself a tiny smile. He looked straight ahead, eyes steady, posture strong. To the world, he was just another Royal Guard. But to those who understood, he was living proof that the greatest strength lies not in the weapon you carry, but in a heart that chooses when not to use it. And that single act of stillness, that quiet defiance, had changed the way people saw the red uniform forever. For weeks after the incident, London felt different. Tourists still gathered outside the palace, but there was a newfound reverence in their whispers. The guards, once seen as part of the pageantry, were now symbols of something deeper. Living reminders that silence doesn't mean weakness. It means mastery. And at the center of it all was one man, Guardsman Thomas Hale. He returned to duty quietly, avoiding interviews and fame. The palace had given him the choice of transfer or promotion, but he chose neither. "I'm a guard," he'd said simply. "This is where I stand." But behind the grand facade of the palace walls, something else was stirring, something the public would never see. The private gathering. One cool evening, a small, discreet meeting took place inside the blue drawing room of Buckingham Palace. No cameras, no press, just a handful of people, including Prince William, Princess Catherine, and a few senior members of the royal household. At the center stood Thomas, still in full uniform. Prince William began softly. "Guardsman Hale," he said. "When this all began, none of us knew how deeply your actions would resonate, not just across Britain, but across the world." Catherine nodded beside him, her voice gentle. "You reminded people that duty doesn't erase emotion, it refines it. You showed compassion under pressure, and that is rarer than any medal." Thomas bowed his head, humbled. "Thank you, ma'am. I only did what felt right." William smiled faintly. And that's precisely why it was right. Then, breaking tradition, the prince did something unexpected. He stepped forward, removed a small velvet box from the table, and opened it. Inside lay a modest medal, one that wasn't part of the public record yet. "The Royal Medal of Civil Courage," William said. "Normally reserved for civilians, but today it belongs to you." There was no applause, no fanfare, only the soft rustle of the medal's ribbon as it was pinned onto his chest. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the weight of centuries of history, one humble guard embodied the spirit of an entire nation. Calm, kind, unyielding, a ripple beyond the palace. The impact of that morning reached far beyond Britain's borders. News outlets from Europe to America covered the story with awe. "The guard who stood still," one headline read. "Duty meets compassion," said another. Even military academies began studying the footage as an example of ethical restraint under threat. One analyst from the Royal Military College wrote, "It is rare to see tactical discipline and human empathy intersect so powerfully in a single act." Guardsman Hale's stillness prevented escalation, not by force, but by presence. Letters poured in from soldiers, veterans, teachers, even prisoners. Many wrote about how that moment gave them hope, how it reminded them that courage doesn't always wear armor. Among them was one letter, written in careful handwriting. "You didn't see me as a criminal. You saw me as a person. I'm getting help now. Thank you for seeing me when no one else did. DM." Thomas never spoke of that letter to anyone, but he kept it, folded, worn, and tucked into the same pocket where his gloved hand had rested that fateful morning. The guard who changed tradition. In the months that followed, something remarkable began to shift inside the Royal Guard's own training doctrine. A new section was quietly added: crisis de-escalation and emotional awareness. It was small, understated, but it carried weight. And when new recruits asked where it came from, senior officers would simply say, "From a man who didn't move and saved everyone." Thomas became a silent legend among them, not a celebrity, not a name for the tabloids, but a story whispered between soldiers who stood for hours without speaking. Sometimes, the older guard would nod toward the palace gates and murmur, "That's where he stood." The quiet visit. One evening, several months later, Thomas finished his shift just as the sky turned from gold to gray. The palace grounds were emptying, and the crowds had gone home. He walked through the quiet courtyard when he noticed someone waiting by the entrance. Princess Catherine. She smiled as he approached. "Thomas," she said softly, "I hope you don't mind me stopping by." "Of course not, ma'am." She handed him a small envelope. Inside was a photograph, one taken from that morning. It showed him standing motionless as the man's hand trembled with the gun. But it wasn't the danger that stood out, it was the calm. the stillness that seemed almost unearthly. "It's a reminder," she said, "that even in chaos, grace can exist." Thomas looked at the photo, then back at her. "I don't think I was graceful, ma'am. Just doing my job." Catherine smiled. "Sometimes doing your job is grace." Then she turned and left, her words lingering in the crisp evening air. Legacy of a moment. Years later, tourists would still talk about that morning. Tour guides would point toward the gates and say, "That's where it happened." The guard who didn't move. Children would press their faces against the iron bars, imagining what it must have felt like. And sometimes, when the crowd was quiet, they'd see a guard standing there, perfectly still, tall, composed, eyes forward, and wonder, could it be him? No one ever knew for sure. Thomas never sought recognition. He served until his term ended, then retired quietly to a countryside town outside Windsor, where he volunteered at a youth center, teaching discipline and compassion to kids who'd lost their way. To them, he wasn't a royal hero. He was just Mr. Hale, the man who taught them how to stay calm when the world feels loud. But every so often, when the palace guard would visit him, young men with shining boots and solemn eyes. And when they did, Thomas would only smile and say, "Remember, the strongest thing you can do sometimes is stand still." That morning outside Buckingham Palace will forever be remembered as more than a royal incident. It was a story of silence louder than any gunshot, of discipline that met compassion halfway, of a man who showed the world that honor isn't about standing above others. It's about standing for them. And long after the headlines faded, one truth remained. Kings rule by tradition, but legends are born from humanity.